All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Don Schnitzler. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's August 2024 webinar presentation. It's good to be back after the summer break. And before we get started, just a little promotion of the Forest History Association. The Forest History Association of Wisconsin has as its mission four kind of pillars: inform, educate, archive, and publish. Tonight's webinar is one example of how we like to inform and educate the public. If you're interested in supporting the mission of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, there is on our website, Forest History Association of Wisconsin, or of WI.com, the membership link, and you can join online if you'd like. So tonight's webinar or presentation, in order to make it successful tonight, we're going to have everyone ask questions or pose questions through the chat feature rather than the Q&A feature. So any questions that arise during the presentation, just put them down in the chat feature, likely located at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the conference, we'll save them all to the end of the conference. At the end of the conference, I will relay them to our speaker, Katie Weichelt, and then she will have an opportunity to answer those questions. If you're new to Zoom or have any challenges, you can reach out to me through that same chat feature, and I will see what I can do from this side. And finally, be aware that at the end of the conference, the webinar, you'll receive a short survey. It's 7 questions, and we'd appreciate you just taking a couple seconds to fill that in so we can have a little feedback to share with our speaker and also for our planning purposes on future presentations. Tonight's presentation is entitled "The Paper Industry Impact on Historical Geography of Wood County and Central Wisconsin." Both lumber and paper industries have both economically and physically transformed the Wisconsin River Valley and played a central role in the urban and community landscape of central Wisconsin. This presentation will describe the key role of the paper industry in creating and renewing communities in the region, with a focus on the paper mill towns of Wood County. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Katie Weichelt, an independent geographer who received her PhD from the University of Kansas in 2016 and was a presenter at our 2018 conference held in Wisconsin Rapids. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the platform over to Katie, because I'm sure you'd prefer to hear her than me. So Katie, I'm going to take my screen down and I'm going to stop sharing if I can here.
And I will share
and have you share your screen.
All right. So can you see mine?
Yes, and you sound good.
Oh, wait. Stop share. I'm going to share again. Try that again. I feel like it didn't. Can you see my?
Right now, I don't see. Okay, now I see your screen again. Your shared
Okay,
screen.
there it goes. I thought I was sharing the wrong one. Just making sure.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I know it's really nice outside if you are in the Wisconsin area, so I do appreciate you hopping on. I am going to talk about paper industry's impact on the historical geography of Wood County. My dissertation was on this very subject, so I'm kind of giving you a flavor or an overview of what I did tackle in that dissertation. I got it from the University of Kansas, and so one of the reasons why I actually took on this topic is because I was looking for a topic, and I was moving to Wisconsin, so it was generally a new area that I was eager to explore. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is really, I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit about why the paper mills are in this region and what kind of impact they had, mostly focusing kind of on the landscape and what initiatives led to that. So I'm not going to be able to touch on every example of or every impact, but mainly in the time we have, just kind of give a flavor of that historical geography. All right. And as I said, we're focusing on kind of Wood County, but in particular, what I'm going to draw examples are from are the communities of Port Edwards, Nakusa, and Wisconsin Rapids. So mainly that southern Wood County area. All right. So one of the things that it's worth mentioning is the history of paper in terms of the technology developments in how it was developed from a rag-based resource to wood-based. So paper was invented or thought to be invented in China and diffused along pretty much the Silk Road through is the Islamic world and adopted widely in the Islamic world and eventually makes its way through trade routes to Europe. There is, if you're interested, this map I took actually from an article called The Historical Diffusion of an Ancient Technique, and it is from a book called Mobilities of Knowledge. So maybe if you Google that, I believe it's it's open access. So hopefully you'll be able to read it if you're interested. What you see according to this map is the paper industry kind of diffusing. It goes to Korea and Japan much earlier than it hits Europe. It's widely adopted, as I said, in the Islamic world, and it's thought that really the adoption of paper influenced the higher literacy rates in the Islamic world before in the Middle Ages than compared to what you would see in Europe. Europeans, they're kind of clinging to parchment, so writing via animal skins. But eventually there's more widespread adoption exposure in European mills. Still at this time, papers continue to be constructed from rags, most likely linen, and it was very much a hand process. The idea of utilizing wood as a resource in producing paper, it didn't really come about until probably at least the 18th century. And over time, that didn't really, where you might see a lot of experimentation with moving to wood-based pulps in the 18th and then later 19th century. The technology to create that wood pulp wasn't really available until around the mid 1800s in a wide scale. The first wood grinder to make wood pulp wasn't installed until Massachusetts until the late 1860s. So there was quite a bit of length of time from using rags to wood. And we'll see that when we look at the history of paper mills in Wisconsin, we often kind of associate paper mills with the forest resources. But the story is a little bit more nuanced and complicated than that. So even with our proximity forested lands, some of those very early mills in Wisconsin, they're still utilizing rag-based production. Okay. Now, paper industry in the United States, we have our first paper mill really in Pennsylvania in around 1691. So when Pennsylvania is still a colony of the British. North American British colonies tended to rely on imports, and that was overall not just paper, but manufacturing as a whole. The British were kind of reluctant to encourage a lot of manufacturing that could potentially compete with their own manufacturing enterprises. It's kind of the standard operating procedures of empires. You want the manufactured goods made in the mainland that you can sell to your colonies. Over time, though, you do see into the early 19th century, more mills appear, mostly located in Pennsylvania and New England. Um, the mills tended to be typically located near urban regions where they had both markets and the resources to get rags. So they could collect rags and then they can sell the product back to that urban region. So as settler colonialism moves westward, so do mills move along. And so we see more mills over time developed in the Midwest and also the Appalachian region as well. Coming in here, I do want to just kind of mention it, repeat again that the technology that allowed for the development of the wood-based pulp, so that grinder, it arrives in the United States, as I mentioned, late 1860s. So in the 1870s and afterwards, we start to see a shift in more mills being built closer to forested regions. And here on the slide, I do have an image. This is from the Library of Congress, but it's an artist rendition of that site near in Pennsylvania. That was the site of the first paper mill. Obviously, it's not reflective of 1861. There is a car in the image, but you can still see the site. All right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about paper production in Wisconsin as a whole. So we see the first instances of paper production in Wisconsin around the late 1840s. We do see a mill that was founded in Milwaukee to supply paper for local newspapers. Again, producing rag-based pulp. So paper produced from this mill was made out of rags, but and not wood-based pulp. Pretty soon after, I think in 1853 in Appleton, we see another mill built. So this would have been one of the first ones in the Fox River Valley. Interestingly, the Fox River Valley, for those, and there might be some people on the webinar from that region and or very familiar with the history. Around this time, there was a lot more flour mills in the region. But as we get into the latter decades of the 19th century, there are a few things that happen that disrupt that economy that's much more reliant on flour mills. One is that we actually see a lot more people, we see that homestead settlement moving into the Dakota territories and wheat farming is actually taken up in those homesteaded territories. So Minneapolis eventually becomes that center of flour industry. And probably not unrelated to the fact that we do see a lot of, to this day, food industry located in Minneapolis. So Pillsbury, one example. And so Minneapolis was kind of on that direct rail line coming from the Dakotas. So that's a disruption. At the same time, we do see a decline in wheat production in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's moving more towards dairying. So that kind of hurts the flour milling industry as well. So it's always interesting. You kind of reconfigure the space with reconfiguring space with railroads, and that will ultimately have a disrupting impact on economies elsewhere. But with out of that flour mill economy, we do see some were former flour mill owners investing in paper mills or converting mills into flour mills into paper mills. For example, we do see the formation of the Kimberly and Clark Company. Kimberly was the son of a flour miller. And so they him and a group of other investors came together and formed the Kimberly and Clark Company in the 1870s. Um, Again, a lot of these early paper mills in the Fox River valleys were utilizing paper, and I think utilizing rags. And over time, they do switch to wood-based pulp, and actually probably pretty soon. But there is, as I said, more nuance to the story. Sometimes it's probably when they're first founded, the water, the river itself is a more attractive resource in the production of paper rather than the forest. You find, and those of you familiar with the region will, and the region's history will know this, but over time you do see a lot of mills develop in that Fox River Valley. And not only is it just paper mills, but you also see a lot of businesses that support the paper mills. So you might find businesses that supply parts to the paper machinery that develop in these towns. So what you can see is an example of clustering. So this is a theory from Michael Porter that you have these businesses that will kind of cluster in an area, and they are related, they're interconnected, they depend on one another, and they're also sharing labor forces. And from there, you can kind of get this upward trajectory of economic growth. All right. I think if I counted correctly when I was originally looking into this, and I was looking at some paper industry related resources, if I counted correctly, I think we see about 11 paper mills and related businesses about by 1880 in the Fox River Valley. By about 1895, that number is closer to 27. So you do see huge growth in the 15-year period. All right, and here's an image of the paper mill at Combined Locks. All right, okay. So, whoops, I forgot to put in my sources, so I'm going to have to say them out loud here. So, I do want to talk about lumber, sawmilling, and paper because it really does have an influence on the adoption of paper milling in the Wisconsin River Valley and central Wisconsin. There is a line, a kind of a direct line there. I do want to take a step back, though, to frame this up. As we talk about the development of paper mills and we also look at lumbering and sawmilling, it's important to think, I think, of the region as a whole and how the Midwest really developed. There is some economic geographers, Brian Page, Richard Walker, and their theory was that the Midwest developed not from an empty space where you came in and first had agriculture and then you built industry on top of it, but rather these things were happening simultaneously. So lumber was really actually commercial lumbering was probably happening illegally before indigenous nations ceded lands in Wisconsin. So you did see some illegal lumbering taking place. Eventually, when lands are ceded, you do see legal development. We see excuse me just a second. Sorry. I need a child needed assistance. Um, where was I? Okay, so lumber was probably taking place for statehood. And honestly, there was probably some squatting and illegal operations before any lands were ceded to the federal government. Over time, though, once those lands are ceded, the federal government acquires the land through purchases, through treaties. We do see these lands opening up to lumbering. And why lumbering needed to was in demand at this time is because we did see settling happen throughout the Midwest. So lands are opening for development, homesteaded settlement. We have what some would refer to as settler colonialism. And with that, you do have demand for lumber's products. So you need lumber to build your houses. You need lumber to build community buildings. So this is drawing that demand for lumber. On the left-hand side of my screen, we do have both of these images come from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Both are from images from the Wisconsin River. One of them is kind of the lower Wisconsin River, photo by H. Bennett, and shows kind of a logging raft. And then we also have a log jam outside of Wausau on the right-hand side of the screen. The lumber industry's rise and fall in the state does lead to this link with the paper industry and why you see the paper industry in the Wisconsin River Valley. So as lumber, there is a demand for lumber, but technology really kind of enables the lumber to be acquired much more easily with the development of railroads. So what happens there? Many of you will be familiar with the story. The white pine is harvested out, and really lumbering declines. With that, there is still other types of timber in the landscape, not white pine, but you do have a resource available to you to utilize. So when lumbering and therefore sawmilling towns decline, some entrepreneurs in the region did see opportunities with the new wood pulp technology to invest in pulp mills. At the same time that this is all happening, we also are seeing increases in demand for paper. People are reading more, you have increased literacy rate, sales of newspapers increase. Just general demand for paper is increasing. So entrepreneurs, business people with the funds to invest in it did see opportunities to make some money. All right. Okay, so the first paper mill in the region was Centralia. Actually, it started as a pulp mill. It was a project of Frank Garrison, who was excited to start the paper mill, but really they needed capital and someone with experience to advise. And I think if you dig into the business narratives of a lot of these different companies in the Wisconsin River Valley, you'll see a lot of collaboration between business owners. You'll see people that had experience in the Fox River Valley, they'll invest in paper mills in the Wisconsin River Valley. So you'll see similar names crop up if you're looking at different business histories. The Centralia Mill gets kicked off around September 1891, 1892. It doesn't last as long as some of the other mills. I think it closed in 1912. I think it was the victim of a fire, actually. So that was the end of that. However, there were it did serve an important example of demonstrating that this was a viable business opportunity for the region. Soon after Centralia, we have the New Coosa Paper Company formed in 1892. Soon mills are kind of established in the kind of the southernmost portion of the Wisconsin River Valley. Tends to move somewhat in northward direction. Not exactly. You see, Tomahawk Pulp and Paper Company was formed in 1894. So that's quite an early one. But a lot of these you'll see Ward Paper Company, not formed in Maryland, 1922. Rhinelander, 1902. Marathon Paper Mills Company, 1909. On and on and on. So you do see there is a very quick succession. Really, when you step back and look, it's a 20-year period. And the older I get, 20 years seems like a much smaller period of time. So you do see quite an expansion of the industry. So it's not the powerhouse compared to the Fox River Valley, but it's still very, very important paper region in the state. It's worth noting that I think the addition of these paper mills in the Wisconsin River, but also, and you also see there's mills kind of in the Chippewa Valley as well too. I'm skipping over them. But this helps move Wisconsin into, I think, about second in the nation in terms of paper production by about 1925. New York State is ahead of them at this time. All right. Now, I'm kind of taking my scale. I kind of started off as kind of international movement, now national scale, mentioned a little bit that, and then statewide. Now I just kind of want to focus on a few communities and how that paper industry impacted them. Again, in our time we have, there's such a rich history there that, and even I don't know it all, but I hope to give you just a little flavor of its impact. All right, so Nakusa, as I mentioned, Nakusa's paper mill was established in 1892 by Thomas Nash. He actually took a very active role in planning and platting out Nakusa. So that's one example of a businessman taking a really direct involvement in the planning of his community. How he got his paper mill off the ground? Well, I think he tried actually to get some investment from some Fox River Valley businessmen or people experienced with the paper mills out there, but rejected. But he did get some investment from a friend up north, John Edwards Jr. So he was able to invest in his paper mill. John Edwards Jr. would also be developing a paper mill in Port Edwards, as we'll see here as well. Both Port Edwards paper mill and the Nakusa paper mill, they had a very, I think you could describe probably as a cooperative relationship. Eventually, those two mills would merge along with also that Centralia mill and formed the Nakusa Edwards Paper Company in 1908. So why that's worth mentioning and why I kind of talk about Port Edwards and Nakusa in the same breath, even though they are separate communities, is because the establishment of the Nakusa Edwards Paper Company really does kind of entwine those groups, entwine the fates of those communities. All right. I do want to kind of point out, I did put a population change chart up here based on some census data. Really, what it's important to kind of point out, you see kind of increase over the 20th century, increase in population. Why that's important? Well, I kind of like to give it as a background because to emphasize that Port Ed Nakusa Edwards Paper Company was a very successful paper company, and they what you'll see is they did kind of invest heavily in that community, those communities, and I think that resulted in a fairly stable population for those areas. All right. Now, here's an image, a couple images of Port Edwards map, and then view of the annex and Port Edwards Hotel. Why I think that this is important. Nakusa and Port Edwards are really good examples of very small company towns. So company towns are, most of the audience might be aware, they're communities constructed usually by mining, lumbering, or manufacturing companies. And they have a goal of kind of housing workers very close to their employment. The residential areas are, very functional. They're there to hire workers more likely than not house single young men to begin. Now, over this time, this changes. You do slowly see that they move from kind of more large communal style living to offering single family homes to rent out to families. So over time, there is kind of more amenities introduced, or the housing options are a little bit more family friendly. Um, Again, it's worth noting the company was able to thrive and was really good about being nimble and adapted to circumstances. As an example, in 1912, you had Canadian newsprint that flooded the market. So a lot of paper mills really had to change their product. And Nakusa Edwards Paper Company moves into wrapping papers to respond to that. And I do like to bring that up just because what you'll see with Nakusa Edwards Paper Company and also Consolidated Paper Company in Wisconsin Rapids, their ability to adapt helps them stay successful, and it offers eventually offers a really great prosperity to those communities. Had these paper bills not been successful, um, I don't want to, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't want to say the communities would not be as successful. But certainly it wouldn't, their fate wouldn't have been tied to paper mills such as much. So Nakusa Edward paper companies, they move into wrapping papers, they move into higher grade papers. I think they also produce things like index cards and blue books. They also do things like expand. So they expand into, they bought a mill in Stevens Point. They build a pulp and paper mill in Arkansas as well. So there is kind of movements within the company to be successful, and they make some smart moves. Um, these successes and struggles of the company, I want to emphasize they don't tend to happen in a vacuum. They're not isolated to Wisconsin or Wood County. Mainly what you'll see is what I found when reading these histories, it's very much reflective of the time and what was happening in the United States as a whole. So one thing that happens, as I mentioned, is when Port Edwards, when Nakusa was in its early histories, you would find a lot of instances of more residential areas designed to house single workers, and you also renting out single family homes for families. But something actually shifts in post World War I. And Marshall Bueller, um, from the Alexander House, has argued that really post 1919, you do see a shift from providing housing for workers to moving away from get away from providing houses, and actually uh, encouraging home ownership within the Nakusa and Port Edwards community. So there was a acrimonious strike in 1919. It went on for months. The company was kind of determined to keep production going. They brought in workers from surrounding rural areas. Eventually, the strike petered out, but there was some really bitter feelings. And after that, you do see a shift to encourage home ownership. So actually, what Nakusa Edwards Paper Company did was provided incentives for workers to purchase their homes. They were either renting or they could build their own. So this starts in 1924. The result is they produced 10 new homes for Port Edwards, and that later expands into 1929, 28 and 29. Some programs, they expanded incentives to include um, things like paint or, oh no, my poor PowerPoint slide. Apparently I can't hit the save button. Some like a sidewalk for your front yard, just other things that really sweeten the deal. Here's some examples that were produced, pick images that were built. This is this image from the Wisconsin Rapids Tribune in 1927. It's just some examples of houses that were built in the Port Edwards and Nakusa area. I think this house below was built in Nakusa and the rest were built in Port Edwards. I would say this is probably not unique though for the region. However, there were a lot more efforts throughout the country to provide amenities for employees. So certainly NEPCO was not alone in this initiatives. There was more of a push nationwide to encourage people to stay in their communities, and really just kind of the reason is because it just kind of tends to engender a more loyal, engaged workforce. Okay, here's another map of available plots for purchase in Port Edwards. Again, this was generously provided by the Alexander House in Port Edwards, Wisconsin. So you see here's a little quick map of plots available. So, and it says, if you are interested in a home in Port Edwards, pick out your lot and file your application with the building committee. Overall, I don't know. I don't think the program was successful as they may have hoped. There was still not a lot of people, or as much as they thought or hoped would take people up on the offer. I don't know the reason for that. I think by this time, well into the 1920s, you definitely had a streetcar that ran from Nakusa to Wisconsin Rapids. So maybe it was because you had all of these communities very close together that workers didn't feel the need to purchase a home in Port Edwards or Nakusa. That's just a hypothesis, but I don't know the answer. All right. Okay. It's not just housing though. NEPCO does produce a lot of services, community building opportunities to the community as well. It would contribute to a lot of community-based initiatives, such as it sponsored picnics. It would pay for uniforms for a marching band, sponsor various sporting events. You had recreation opportunities at NEPCO Lake, and provided electricity. And that's just kind of some of the sampling of items that you would see that the company would produce for the communities. So it was quite a large presence. I really like this preliminary town plan for the village of Port Edwards. It's from the Wisconsin State Historical. It's found at the Wisconsin State Historical Society, and is, I think, a version of it or a printed version of it is available at the Alexander House as well. What I find interesting about this plan is really seems to be reflective of this push or trend in company towns to really pull in elements of that you'd find in rural English villages or the English garden communities at the time. So you'll see more of a push for that with characteristics to include tree-lined streets, quaint housings, more open spaces, and park areas. And this town plan team seems to reflect that. You definitely have the tree-lined streets. On this, you do have this island with a lot of park area. This didn't fully come to fruition. Unfortunately, the timing of it really hits in that 1930s with the Great Depression. So unfortunately, leaders of NEPCO had to, and Louis Alexander, the leader of NEPCO at the time, had to scale back his plans for the community. But the plan was there, and it's definitely, I think, reflective of some wider trends that are happening with company towns at the time. All right. Okay. Now, transformation of Wisconsin Rapids, we see similar things happening here. However, there is some slight differences. Wisconsin Rapids is a much bigger community. It's formed out of the kind of twin cities of Centralia and Grand Rapids. Interestingly, they merged to become one political unit around the same time as the Consolidated Paper Company was formed. It's a much more diverse economically than Port Edwards and Nakusa. You'll see in looking at kind of the census of manufacturers, you see the number of manufacturing establishments really increases between 1860 and 1900s, drops off a little bit after that. And you see when you look at the type of manufacturing, you'll see some relation to forest industry. You'll see, like, say, hub and spoke or furniture manufacturing companies. But it's not all related to paper. But paper plays an important part. In fact, in my next slide, I found this newspaper advertisement. It's for the First National Bank, but in that it communicates how paper was an important part of the community. So one of Wisconsin Rapids' most important sources of wealth is its great paper industry. And it goes on to describe like how it's an important part of the region. So this is a newspaper advertisement for the First National Bank. It's from 1922. So it just kind of recognizes paper as a central force. Now, much like NEPCO, Consolidated Paper Company made some very, very smart investments. In fact, in the 1930s, as many of you might know, already, they very astutely invested in coated paper, which enabled them to get the lucrative contract to produce paper for Life magazine. So again, really smart business decisions allowed for the prosperity of the community. I'm getting close on time, so I probably better wrap it up. I'm seeing it's already 7:14. Over time, with the growth of morphology of Wisconsin Rapids, you see if you're kind of looking, if you ever look at Sanborn maps, those are really great resources to see how communities change over time. Certainly, you see changes in, well, Grand Rapids and Centralia transitioning into Wisconsin Rapids. So you do see the expansion, you'll see development of new business areas, you see new residential areas that emerge over the early decades of the 19th century and 20th century. And you also see transition in building materials. So you'll see over time, when you look at the maps, you'll see fewer wooden materials in that downtown area and um, more permanent stone structures emerging as well. So in this image of a Sanborn map, you see kind of that transition to more stone permanent buildings. The wooden buildings are still very much present. They're highlighted in yellow right here. Now, as the city, as paper, the company becomes much more prosperous, city leaders are turning their attention to amenities, and they want to also beautify the city. This was kind of happening to a lot of different cities and communities in the Midwest. Some scholars have said it was probably an insecurity from the region, and they felt kind of compelled to more beautify their spaces. So that meant kind of removing some of these more older, dilapidated wood building and replacing them with kind of really beautiful stone buildings, really with nice architecture features. Now, George Meade, leader of Consolidated, was at the forefront of a lot of these initiatives. He worked with some women's groups actually to revitalize some of these wooden buildings along the riverfront, but he was certainly involved in that. So I suppose what makes Wisconsin Rapids different than Nakusa and Port Edwards is you very much have a presence of the Meads and Consolidated and other business people, but there's a much more, or what I perceive it as, collaborative effort. There's a lot of different people and groups working together on that. There's much more direct control with Nakusa Edwards Paper Company. All right. Okay. Again, here's an image of the some wooden buildings that were replaced eventually with kind of those with that push to upgrade buildings and preserve the bank of the Wisconsin River. So these buildings would be removed as a part of that kind of cleanup initiative or that city beautiful work. But beyond beautification efforts, Meade and Consolidated and other prominent businessmen and women, they did things like provided land for garbage dumps, they funded swimming pools, they provided electricity to houses, funded schools and trade programs, helpful for educating a future workforce. I think J.D. Witter's wife, another paper founder, she donated money for a new hospital. So there was a lot of different ways that the founders contributed to the amenities in the community. So that is just beyond kind of beautifying the space, but but beautifying the community was an important effort that was happening in the early decades of the 20th century. In fact, I have a quote here that a local newspaper wrote about George Meade. They wrote, "Beauty is a prerequisite with any development undertaken by Mr. Meade. He employs methods that cannot result in anything but the creation of handsome buildings ideally suited practical in every phase, but nevertheless unique for this simplicity and beauty. So a nice little quote there. All right. It's 7:20, so I do want to kind of wrap things up to allow time for any discussion. The question kind of always becomes, how does this shift and why does this shift? Because it's around the late 20th century into the early 21st century that we really see this decline of, I think, what some scholars would call as a more uh, paternalistic or movement to of providing amenities for the community directly from the company. The reason is because of increased globalization and consolidation within the paper industry. It leads to the eventual selling and closure, what is now closure of some of the paper mills. So um, the Port Edwards paper mill closed in 2008. As we know, the Wisconsin Rapid paper mill sold to Stora Enso in the early 2000s. Eventually sold, changed hands, but now is closed. So the paper industry has become a much more smaller component of the regional economy, but it's still present as well. Interestingly, sometimes in some of the discussions that I had with folks, some have said the change is probably a little good because what happened in Wisconsin Rapids is that actually, because the Meads were such a presence in the community, it didn't really engender others in the community to kind of take responsibility for that community building aspect. So it will be up to these communities to kind of navigate their way forward. But just to close it out, you still kind of see the paper industry's presence on the landscape. Certainly, you might see the name Mead or Witter on the landscape. You'll definitely see elements of the paper mill industry there, and Nakusa's mill is still operating as well. It's 7:22, so I want to wrap it up and I'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Katie. Very informative. I love the way you kind of wove the stories in with the pictures, graphs, and charts. It really helps give a better understanding of things. We only have a couple questions, or at least to start with. When the slide was up on lumbering, sawmilling, and paper, William asked a question about why was lumbering illegal? Was it because it was taking place on land that the federal government had not yet sold?
Right. Yeah. Sorry if I wasn't clear. I think there was some illegal squatting on lands that technically belonged. Um, well, for example, we in the Wisconsin River, where you see where Nakusa, Port Edwards is now, you had that 3 mile strip treaty where federal government purchased lands from the Menominee. I think I've read of cases where people were kind of taking lumber illegally before those lands were officially ceded. Um, so in historical accounts, they tend to be, they reference instances of that. It's not necessarily wide scale operations or large operations, but some thieving of lumber at the time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Elizabeth had a question about whether or not the companies provided any type of financing to help when they were selling homes to their workers, or were they just outright purchases?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they did, although I don't know the specifics of that, Elizabeth. That's a really good question that I do want to look into. I believe they offered um, some kind of generous financing. I believe I recall reading that, but I don't know the specifics. But thank you for the question. Now I'll have to look it up.
Okay, and then one other one, when you were talking about the manufacturers in Wood County, when you were doing your research, did you do any comparisons between Wood County, Portage County, Marathon County to see how the numbers compared?
You know what? I didn't. And I'm kind of wondering why didn't I do that? Because usually as any geographer and would do that kind of you'd kind of want to get a sense of what it looks like in the larger context. So I don't think I did it at the time because I think I was just simply focused on the story of Wood County. Um, but so unfortunately, I do not. Um, but I think it's definitely much more a line of inquiry I do want to pursue.
Okay, so does anyone else have any questions? I don't see any coming up right now. I think it was a wonderful presentation, and I'm going to take the sharing away from Katie for a second and share my screen, just because I want to point out one thing before I, oops, let's see.
Maybe I have to stop share.
Oh, you might, so you might have to. Is yours stop share?
Yep, now yours is up. I
Mine is
see
up.
the
Okay.
your
What I
screen.
wanted to point out is that coming up in October, the Wisconsin Forest History Association has a fall conference coming up. That will be October 11th and 12th at Kashina. On our website, you can actually get to the registration information if anyone is interested in more details. There's a brochure there that you can look at to find out the timeline, schedule at glance. And if you're interested in registering, you can register online. And then down a little bit down from there, there's a list of upcoming webinars. We just saw or listened to Katie tonight, but down below are two webinars that are coming up in September for our pre-conference webinars. The first one is the removal of New York Indians onto Menominee lands, and that's going to be given by Dr. Carol Cornelius on September 11th. And then the following week, the Tribal Preservation Officer, David Reno, will talk about the Menominee tribal treaties. So both interesting presentations, kind of as a lead into the upcoming fall conference. And I hope you would all think about joining us for that. Registration, the conferences, that the webinars are free, but it does require you to pre-register like you did for tonight's webinar. So again, thank you, Katie, for a great presentation. I'm sure everybody appreciates the information you shared and the time that you spent putting it together for us and then actually presenting it. Thank you also to everybody who joined us tonight. We appreciate the fact that you are interested in continuing your lifelong learning journey by joining us at these webinars. Again, you're going to get a short survey. We'd appreciate if you take a little time to fill that out. And then these webinars are recorded and will be added to our YouTube channel. Because there's events going on in Marshfield this week that I'm tied up with, it probably won't get up on the website or on the YouTube until next week. But the recordings will be made available to everyone so that if you missed it tonight or had to bow out or only missed part of it, you can find it, or if someone asks you about it, you can tell them that it's coming. So with that, again, thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you next month for our next webinars on September 11th and 18th. Good night, everyone.